We're going to do a survey of the book of Daniel, and this is part one. The book of Daniel is a combination of stories and prophecy. And what you'll see there are some stories that have prophetic implications, and then there are some prophecies that have stories attached to them. Like Daniel would say, I had a vision or I saw this. And so there's the narrative portion and then the prophecy itself. But these are the three famous stories. If I was asked to do a Sunday school class for kids on Daniel, I would be talking about these things. But they have, as I said, prophetic implications. Every chapter has a story that has prophecy. Every chapter has prophecy, but it's based on a story. You see the one world economy, the one world religion, and the one world government. Then we have some other stories, and you see the return of a king. Philippians chapter 2, verse 7 and 8 talk about Jesus Christ giving up his godly appearance and taking on the form of a man. We're going to get into that. And then chapter 5 is the sudden defeat of a king. And you see how these things have implications, not just in the book of Daniel, but also the book of Revelation. Why do we go into eschatology? First of all, so that we would work for him. Second of all, that we would live for him. And third of all, that we'd be excited to do it. And if we work for him and live for him and are excited to do it, we will be blessed. Revelation chapter 1. There are two themes in Daniel. The first one is how to live in a post-Christian society. And we're definitely in a post-Christian society. And the way to live in a post-Christian society is to keep your nose clean and your knees dirty. There's also, as a subtitle to that theme, how not to live in any society. And the satraps and the administrators, they bring that out, particularly in chapter 3, the furnace, and chapter 6, the lion's den. So here we are in chapter 1, two themes. Theme number 1, how to live in a post-Christian society. Daniel resolved, or the King James says, purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. There's a difference between a conviction and a preference. In that particular scene, if I preferred vegetables over meat, and they said, you got to eat the meat or you're going to die, if I had a preference, I'd say, well, maybe I'll try some. On the other hand, a conviction says, you got to eat the meat or die. I'll die. So, how to live in a post-Christian society? Resolve in your heart not to defile yourself. A verse from Luke, one who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much. For Daniel, today it was the food, tomorrow it's the lion's den. For Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, today it's the food, tomorrow it's the furnace. One who is faithful in a very little will be faithful in much. So here you see Daniel, and the punchline of Daniel and the food was he ended up being 10 times better than the others. And to put that into modern parlance, if a perfect SAT is 1,600, these guys scored 16,000. The second theme is God is sovereign over all affairs. Now, we're going to talk about kings and kingdoms, but he's also sovereign over my affairs. There's the sovereignty of God, and it does not conflict with the free will of man. God simply knows what free choices I'm going to make. So God is sovereign in all affairs. And the verse that we look there is he changes times and seasons. He removes and sets up kings. In the case of Nebuchadnezzar, he set him up, he removed him, and he set him up again. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. So two themes: how to live in a post-Christian society, and God is sovereign over all affairs. Daniel chapter 4 is interesting. Daniel chapter 4 talks about Nebuchadnezzar, who goes insane for 7 years and then comes back. And that verse, the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes and sets over them the lowliest of men. Now, the Bible says that aside from Jesus, the smartest man was Solomon. But aside from Jesus, the meekest man was Moses. But there's only one adjective that Jesus ever ascribed to himself. He says, "Take my yoke upon me and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart." What we're going to see in the book of Revelation, prophesied in the book of Daniel, is that there are these going to be kingdoms that are set up, and they're going to be taken down by the lowliest of men. Now, the Bible talks about Jesus as being King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And the Bible says that if you've been saved, you are considered a priest and a king. We will rule and reign with him for 1,000 years. And so on that same verse, the lowliest of men, at one point, you have to suck up your pride and bow down to Jesus. And so there's a historical piece here where we're going to see the Babylonians, the Medes, Persians, the Greeks, the Romans. There's a current situation, receiving Jesus Christ, and there's a prophetic situation, Revelation chapter 19. So we go to chapter 2. I had a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream. This is Nebuchadnezzar, and he had this famous dream of this image. And Daniel interprets the dream. He says, "You saw, O king, a great image, the image mighty and exceeding brightness. It stood before you, and its appearance was frightening." He not only interpreted the dream itself under duress. If the wise men could interpret the dream, they're all going to die. He gave him the dream, he gave him the interpretation, and he gave him the emotions he was feeling as the dream came across. The head of this image was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, the legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. Now that's all historical, and you can see those dates there. And when we get to chapter 8, we're going to expand on those particular dates and some of the scenarios associated with that. But I want you to notice that there are some prophecies that are not yet fulfilled. Now, when we talk about those that have already been fulfilled, we can look at it with great historical accuracy. It could be corroborated by secular history, by archaeology. When you look into the future, don't get hung up on one person's interpretation over the other. I'll give you a grand example. Those 10 toes, some will say it's the European Union. Some used to say it's the European Common Market. Some will say it's the 10 regions of the Roman Empire. Some will say the globalists have established 10 regions across the world. The details don't matter. The point that matters is this: there will be set up a kingdom run by the Antichrist, pulling together all of the characteristics of all these historical empires. And you see that rock down at the bottom? Jesus Christ is going to come back, Revelation chapter 19, and take care of all that stuff. As you look, the stone was cut out by no human hand, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Now, what's going to be left? Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, the gold, all together were broken in pieces and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floor, and the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them could be found. Here comes the punchline. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Jesus Christ is coming back. He's going to set up his millennial kingdom, and he's going to be King Jesus in the capital city of Jerusalem, Mount Zion. This was the dream. Now we'll tell the king its interpretation. O king, and the thing I want to bring out on this particular slide is the past tense. When we get to chapter 7, some folks will say that the lion with the eagle's wings, the bear, the leopard, the beast, those all point out to historical Babylon, Medes, etc. But you're going to see the phrase, the kingdoms will be established. So speaking of regime change, enemies of Israel, allies with God. Nebuchadnezzar was called God's servant, and Cyrus was called God's shepherd. Well, what kind of guys were these? his servant and his shepherd. This comes from Psalm 137. It talks off by saying, how can we sing when we're a foreign language? We just hang our harps on the willow trees. Then you come down verse 8, O daughter of Babylon, he's talking to the Babylonians, doomed to destruction. The Medes and Persians are going to take over. Blessed is he, the Medes and the Persians, who repay you for what you Babylonians have done to the Jews. Now, what did the Babylonians do to the Jews? He who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. When the Babylonians crossed over the wall into Jerusalem, they took those babies and did them in. Now you say, oh, that sounds disgusting. That's the closest we can come to partial birth abortion. Which leads us to the question, who's the bad guy? You see Putin, you see Z, you see Nikita Khrushchev, and on October of 1960, he took off his shoe and beat it against the desk, and he said, we shall bury your grandchildren. Well, he was off by a few generations, but socialism is in the process of burying my grandchildren right now. So who's the enemy after all? This is a cartoon strip from the 1970s, Pogo, and he would say, we have met the enemy, and he is us. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness. We are living right now, to borrow an analogy from the image of Nebuchadnezzar, we live in toe time. The clay will mix with the iron, and there's not going to be any congealing. It's going to be a little of this, a little of that, and just total weakness. And our government today is weak. So then I want to make a few comments about the names. Daniel, and you see that on the left, that was his Hebrew name. And then you see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And those on the right, those are the Babylonian names. Now, when we get to chapter 4, when we talk about Nebuchadnezzar going insane, you'll see how Nebuchadnezzar stopped referring to him as Belteshazzar, his Babylonian name, and started referring to him as Daniel, which means the judgment of God is my judge. But I want you to look at that second column, and we're going to read it as a sentence. God is my judge, who is gracious, who is like God. He is our help. There's a message there. The book of Daniel, the word Daniel appears 35 times in that book, and it means God is my judge, but my God is gracious, and my God is a helper. So we come to chapter 3, and again, two themes. The theme of how to live in a post-Christian society. Daniel purposed in his heart not to defile himself. But then also theme 2, the eschatology. And here you see the one world religion. Revelation chapter 13 talks about the beast making an image, and whoever does not bow down to the beast gets beheaded. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, this is their response to Nebuchadnezzar. They say, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fire furnace. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods. So there's a character, not an individual, but a characteristic there, because there were characters on display. There's a character on display here. First of all, faith. And there's a verse from Hebrews chapter 11 that talks about through faith, quench the power of the flame. We also see trust. Now, this is interesting because that particular chapter focused on those three guys. But I want you to look at Ezekiel. Some of the guys didn't survive the fire. Now, Ezekiel's pretty wide open book. I can't wait till we study Ezekiel. That doesn't say that happened during Babylonian time or some other time, but some of the people would be just as firm as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and we would use the phrase actual mileage may vary. So there are some types and shadows in chapter 3. Nebuchadnezzar is the Antichrist. The image is the one world religion. The Chaldeans and the Antichrist minions. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Israel during the tribulation. Now I find this the interesting one. Daniel, a picture of Israel being raptured. When you read chapter 3, there's no mention of Daniel. They built this image out in the plain, and there's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the satraps, the administrators, and they say everybody was invited, and Daniel didn't show. Some commentators will try to say, well, he was off doing the king's business. Well, he was doing the king's business. Some will say he was there, but he was exempt from the bow down. I don't think so when you think of the pride that Nebuchadnezzar had. I want you to look how chapter 2 ended. Daniel interpreted the dream. He said, oh, king, by the way, would you do me a huge favor? Would you set up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as rulers over some of the provinces? And then it ends, Daniel remained at the king's court. When you study end times and you think of all the garbage that the Antichrist is going to pull off and all the trials, if you're saved, you don't have to worry about it because you will remain in the king's court. So chapter 4 is the insanity chapter, and it actually begins in chapters 2 and 3. There you see the faith and the trust of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You see Daniel was absent. You see the Chaldeans and the satraps. They showed off their malice and jealousy. But then you see Nebuchadnezzar, and you see words like troubled, angry, furious, rage. Now, the difference between rage and furious is if you can be furious and still control yourself, rage, you're out of control. And we're going to see a cycle of, a cycle of pride and humility. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they come out of the fire, and Nebuchadnezzar praises their God, and then he goes off and does something again. There's this humility, this cycle of pride and humility. And I'm going to come to that, and I'm going to say this. Don't stop praying for people who need to be saved. I've heard so many testimonies. I've prayed for my mother for 20 years. I've prayed for so-and-so. Don't stop praying, because at some point, every knee's going to bow in heaven, on earth, and under the earth. Everybody's going to bow. My first pastor would say, the saddest words in the English language are too late. So there's Nebuchadnezzar, and he goes insane, and he goes out and he has to feast with the beasts for 7 years. And the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes and sets them over the lowliest of men. So Nebuchadnezzar, during those 7 years, is going through a transformation. He's going to go from someone else's God to his God. Let me fill the screen here. In reference to the dream, he praises the God of Daniel for interpreting the dream. In reference to the furnace, he praises God for having those guys survive the fires. But then in Daniel chapter 4, it is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High has performed for me. You want to testify to somebody? Don't worry about memorizing scripture verses. Just simply say, this is what God has done for me. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. Now, if he made this decree, he wrote it into what is called a cuneiform, a cylinder of clay, and they inscribed it in there, and then they baked it. There are over 10,000 cuneiforms between the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania Museum that have yet to be translated. 3 weeks ago, I was reading this article where in Israel, they're using artificial intelligence to speed up the translation. How cool would it be if they translate this cuneiform? Nebuchadnezzar, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. Sounds like Peter. Peace be multiplied to you. Nebuchadnezzar made his peace with God, and he's trying to get other folks to understand it. It has seemed good to me to show the signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion endures from generation to generation. There's a prayer, not gimme, 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 but adoration and exaltation. Then we come to chapter 5, the handwriting on the wall. You've been weighted in the balance and found wanting. Once again, Daniel appears on the scene thanks to Belshazzar's mother and the fall of the kingdom that night. Before we get to that, we need to take a look at the Nebuchadnezzar's family tree. There's Nebuchadnezzar in pink. He dies, and then you see that the kingdom goes left to right. It goes to one son, then it goes to another son, then it goes drop down to his grandson, and then it goes over to another son who happened to have married his sister. You see that a lot in the Old Testament. You see it in the New Testament. Herod's family is just a big incestuous family. But the point that needs to be made is this. When Belshazzar was in there and they're drinking from the goblets from the temple, Daniel wasn't invited, but his mother, the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, said, you know, there's this guy named Daniel who might be able to help you out with that handwriting. This is the interpretation of the matter. Many, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Now, when we get to chapter 7, we're going to find out that that particular dream and vision that Daniel had occurred before Babylon fell, which means he had a preview of what was going to happen. And even though they did not have the alphabet that we use, the sounds, and Medes and Persians, you have been found wanting, and your kingdom is divided. Chapter 6 is now the lion's den. So here's the context. God set up Nebuchadnezzar. Jeremiah refers to him as God's servant. Nebuchadnezzar gets too proud for his own good. God strikes him down. Belshazzar was aware of all this. You study all the different ages. He was an adult as Nebuchadnezzar was insane, and his mother was Nebuchadnezzar's daughter. I don't know if she went out into the plain and stroked the cow or what that she did. The Babylonian kingdom was going to end, and it was given to the Medes and Persians. Keep in mind, Daniel in the lion's den is future. It's under the Medes and the Persians. So here's the storyline. The other leaders became jealous because King Darius was going to set up Daniel on top of everybody. They weren't just jealous, they were nervous because they were corrupt. And they found out that Daniel was not corruptible. So they created a scheme to get rid of Daniel, and they knew three things. First, the king could not change the decree. That was what was set up in the Medes and the Persians. Once a decree was written down, you couldn't repeal it, just like the book of Esther. Second, they knew that Daniel would never deny his faith in God. And based on those two things, their plan could not fail. According to their laws, the king threw Daniel into the lion's den. Daniel survived overnight, and the leaders turned in the den. They weren't down there for very long. So, I've got 13 minutes, 16 minutes. And we're going to go through the passage of Daniel in the lion's den. And as we do, I want to change the title to Christ in the lion's den and see the parallels between what happened to Daniel and what happened to Jesus. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. and satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. The king saw that there was a little bit of erosion in his revenues, and he wanted to patch the hole. Now, Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the other two. He was one of the three and 120 underneath, and they wanted to make Daniel over those. Well, that meant that he would shut down the schemes of the other 2/3. I want you to notice the King James says that he had an excellent spirit in him. This is Luke chapter 2, as Jesus was returning with Mary and Joseph after they found him in the temple, and the child grew, waxed in strong and spirit, filled with wisdom. As we read through this, please note that the left margin is the Daniel passage, and the indentation is the Christ parallel. At this, the administrators and satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel. And then you see in Matthew, they were seeking false testimony against Jesus. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. And that made them jealous. Pilate knew that for envy they had delivered him. Finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man unless it was something to do with the law of his God." What a testimony for 122 people to say, "We can't find anything wrong with this guy." So these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king. There's the king on his throne. In walk 122 guys, and they say, "We have agreed." We'll get to that very shortly. The parallel, the chief priest and the elders of the people gathered in the palace of the high priest, and they plotted together in order to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. Now, the royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed. Did they all agree? No, because Daniel was one of them, and he wouldn't agree. In fact, he didn't even know that the conspiracy was going on. Just like in the Sanhedrin, there were two dissenters, at least. There was Joseph of Arimathea, and there was Nicodemus. The royal administrators, etc., have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. One world government, one king, and anybody that is going to be against that, too bad for them. Now, your majesty, they wanted him to hurry up. We've all agreed, if you don't do this, you're looking at all your guys and saying, "I don't believe what you're saying." So they pushed him, they rushed him. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. So King Darius put the decree in writing. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. And we're going to read that those windows were opened, he faced Jerusalem, and he prayed. He didn't push back on the king. He didn't try to come up with a rule that would override the rule. Just like Jesus, we see here from Isaiah where he says he opened not his mouth. Well, Jesus did say some things. The one I appreciate the most is, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." 3 times a day, Daniel got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. And Christ prayed 3 times as well in the Garden of Gethsemane. So leaving them, Peter, James, and John again, he went away and prayed for the 3rd time, saying the same words again. We're going to read where Daniel prayed just as he had always done. Then those men went as a group and found Daniel praying. Jesus was praying. He left those 3. He said, "Your spirit is willing, but your flesh is weak." He went and prayed back some more. And while he was talking to God, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a great crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. So the satraps went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except you, your majesty, will be thrown into the lion's den? When they say anybody except you, if they do, that's treason. So what was Christ accused of? Treason. And they began to accuse him, saying, we found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar. Now, in the case of Jesus, it was cash, right? Is it lawful to give our taxes to Caesar or not? And he says, what belongs to Caesar belongs to Caesar. What belongs to God belongs to God. But tribute means more than just cash. Then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of those Jews, there's anti-Semitism again, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. Well, in fact, Daniel paid a great deal of attention to that king. He was his chief advisor. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed, and he was determined to rescue Daniel. Now, let me encourage you to read your Bibles. Things will come out of your Bible that you had never seen before. And something came out of my Bible in this study that is truly remarkable. And we're going to see that. The king heard this, he was distressed, and he was determined to rescue Daniel. Pilate was also distressed, and we read there that Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, if you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. Back to Daniel, and the king made every effort until sundown to save him. Matthew's gospel, when it was evening. Well, the Jewish people count evening at sundown. At sundown, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who also was a disciple of Jesus, and he went to Pilate and he asked for the body. Back to Daniel. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said, remember, your majesty, that according to the law, you cannot repeal it. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. Pilate was reluctant. Pilate wanted to somehow save Jesus. He threw Barabbas up there as maybe another way out. So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. He threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. Now we're going to do a little bit of a shift here and take a look at Psalm 22. That's one of those messianic psalms. And we're going to start in verse 13. They opened wide their mouths at me like a ravening and roaring lion, just like the satraps and the administrators, just like a roaring lion. They divided my garments, but you, O Lord, do not be far off. You by help, come quickly to my aid. Deliver my soul from the sword, my precious life from the power of the dog. Save me from the mouth of the lion. The psalm was written 500 years before Daniel was in the lion's den. Daniel had an SAT score of 16,000. Whether he had those scriptures available to him or not, we know that he had some. He had a photographic memory. And he could pull this psalm up right as he is being put into that lion's den. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles. Now, why do you think he had to have his nobles put that seal on there as well? Well, the fact of the matter is that those guys knew that the king was not very interested in killing Daniel. The king could have gone and broken the seal, gotten Daniel out, and resealed the tomb, the lion's den. And we're going to see that same thing with the tomb of Jesus. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. The stone, the seal, and the certainty. This comes from Matthew's gospel. And Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen shroud and laid it in his own tomb, which he had cut in the rock. And he rolled a great stone to the entrance of the tomb and went away. Pilate said to them, chief priests, "You have a guard of soldiers." The other three gospels are mute on what is being said right here, right now. And he does not say, "I'm giving you a guard of soldiers." He said, "You have a guard of soldiers." The chief priests had temple guards. And so all my life, I just pictured Roman soldiers around the grave, and the earthquake came. It never mentions that they're Roman soldiers. And I often thought, there's Pilate, and there was the bribe. If it came out that Pilate let them bribe his soldiers and his soldiers were not put to death, Pilate would have to die. I'm convinced they were Jewish soldiers. Go, make it as secure as you can. So they went and made the tomb secured by sealing the stone, Pilate's seal, the king's seal, and setting the guard, the Jewish soldiers, the satraps' seals. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. And here you see Luke's gospel, but on the first day of the week at early dawn, they went to the tomb, taking the spices they had prepared. And when he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" Daniel's answer, "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They did not hurt me." In Matthew's gospel, behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. Because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty. And Pilate said, "I find no fault in him at all." The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And the resurrected Christ, they worshiped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy. When Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him because he had trusted in his God. King James says, because he believed in his God. And we read from Acts, "For you will not abandon my soul to Hades, or let your Holy One see corruption." And at the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Listen to what the Jewish people said to Pilate. And all the people answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." Then King Darius wrote to all the nations and peoples of every language in all the earth. This is another cuneiform that I wish they would translate and see it. John's gospel. Pilate also had a decree. Pilate also wrote an inscription and put it on the cross, and it read, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." Many of the Jews read this inscription, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Aramaic, in Latin, and in Greek. Just like King Darius set out a decree for all the nations, those were the languages that ruled the world at that time: Aramaic, Latin, and in Greek. So the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, "Do not write King of the Jews, but rather, this man said, I am King of the Jews." Pilate answered, What I have written, I have written. I'm convinced Pilate was a saved man. He was a little wimpy when they said, well, we're going to tell Caesar on you. But he comes back here and he declares Christ as King of the Jews, not Caesar, King of the Jews. Caesar had his empire. He says, what I have written, I have written. Then King Darius wrote to all the nations of the people of every language in all the earth, may you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. And we read in Colossians that Christ's death, burial, and resurrection have been proclaimed to all creation. Just like Darius, every part of my kingdom. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. And the gospel also prospered. We talked about Ascension Day as the class started up. As Jesus was about to ascend, he said, ye shall receive power. After that, the Holy Ghost has come upon you. And ye shall be witnesses unto me, both in Jerusalem, in all Judea, and in Samaria, and unto the uttermost part of the earth.